related to cost data collection stuff. Fun, exciting, action-packed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending our conference. And everybody on virtual land, thank you for logging in and being part of our conference. We'd also like to remind you, and I'm sure that Shirley's on, she'll give you a little bit more information on the financial symposium that will be part of the Safety Summit coming up this spring. So we tried to do 2 finance-specific conferences, symposiums directly related to and only related to EMS-related financial aid or legal considerations. So Shirley, if you'll give us just a quick 411 on when the Safety Summit is going to be up in Denver this spring.
Allowed to talk. It's kind of cool to be able to tell Shirley she can't talk.
Shirley, you're up on EMS.
Well, thank you. Yes, the next financial symposium is going to be April 4th, 2023 at the Embassy Suites in downtown Denver. It will be all in person. We will have Asbel, Scott, and Matt all there, including Tim and Kim. So we'll be working on the agenda shortly after this conference. So I would like for you to either email me or Kim and let us know what topics that you would like to have discussed at the next forum.
Excellent, thank you, Shirley. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Scott Moore.
It's like seriously overselling, because now I'm gonna I always try and under promise, over deliver. So thank you, Tim, thank you, Kim, and Shirley, and the rest of everybody for permitting me to drop in virtually into your conference. And I wanted to say just off the top, I did, and I still have not, because of the busyness yesterday, I have not gotten a chance to get those answers for you, but I will get them hopefully by the close of business tomorrow, relative to our session yesterday on volunteer labor. That being said, I was just in fact, dropped off of a conference call with the faculty for the cost collection from the AAA. We were in the middle of setting up conferences and talking about the schedule for 2023. So, and to that, begs today's presentation, and these slides are more or less the slides that we put together for an intensive session that we did a couple of weeks ago at the AAA's annual conference in Nashville. And the intent of these, there's a whole bunch of sort of slides relative to cost collection that we've done over the last 4 or 5 years. And, there's a 90-minute overview, which we certainly could have done, but I'm not sure that most of you who have attended the overviews before would get a lot. There is a bit of that overview in here. So I don't wish to be repetitive, but I will say is that this is your session. And despite being virtual, we'll try and be as interactive as possible. I think we did a pretty good job with that yesterday. So I'm here for the next 90 minutes, and Kim has reminded me that I need to stay on track and make sure that I hit my time limits. So what I'll say is I'll keep talking as long as you all keep asking questions, or unless Kim shuts down my video and or audio. So thank you again to all of you. As Tim had so nicely introduced me, my name is Scott Moore, longtime EMS guy. I've been the HR and operations consultant to the AAA. How did I end up the cost collection guy? Well, it was back before anybody thought that human resources and workforce were really a big issue. And so they said, well, hey, I know we hired you as our HR guy, but would you do cost collection? And I said, sure. So I am one of a bunch, and actually we're missing a few people off of this slide. We have added some faculty folks who, have an interest in participating or assisting the AAA in its efforts to get out there and talk to EMS agencies around the country about cost collection. If you are one of those people and have an interest in participating in that, we would, welcome you to do so. You can always just send an email into hello@ambulance.org. That goes into the ticketing system. And one of the, I think now 12 or 13 of us would be happy to respond to that. What I'll say is, generally speaking, whenever we do these presentations, especially if we send folks out, we try and send one of sort of the core faculty members, myself, Brian Werfel, Asbel, Steve Worth, and then also another partner faculty member who still works actively in an ambulance service, so that we have a good mix of both, not only the theoretical and sort of the idea and the legislative arguments or reasons behind it, but then also some of the more practical things that that you folks who are doing this stuff every single day see. Again, just a quick disclaimer, this intent of this educational program is to be informational and it doesn't constitute legal, financial, or accounting advice. If you need a legal, financial, or accounting advice, you should seek a certified or licensed person in your area. The objectives over this next 90 minutes are really going to do a really quick background and history on cost collection. For those of you, there are still a whole bunch who, by the way, just got on the ship like in the last month. And then, by the way, we were just planning a webinar for December, which will be cost collection for procrastinators, because we know many people haven't even begun to engage. I was at a meeting in a fire-based association group the other day, and someone said, yeah, we heard that it might not happen, which is interesting because the law was passed like in 2018. So it's definitely happening. And in fact, it's here. We're going to talk about the important role that we think cost collection plays in EMS and our profession. We're going to talk a little bit about the timeline and how it's been amended based upon the pandemic, as well as some scenarios and some Q&A if you have any questions. And then we aren't going to do, I have on here that we would do an Amber demo. If this group wishes to have an Amber demo when we do that financial symposium, or if we want to do a standalone webinar event, I can get Aaron, director who works with the group who designed Amber, which is the software that AAA put together, to help and assist EMS agencies as they embarked on this cost collection. We can arrange that. That's no problem. Many of you are already on Amber. Amber is, again, it was a software developed by the AAA. I think it would have been developed a little bit differently had we known there was going to be a couple of year delay. But really the intent of that software was to give people an opportunity to enter their stuff into a web-based tool similar to what CMS is going to provide, but that this tool has error checking and some other things that will prevent you from submitting data that's garbage. And we'll talk why that's potentially a problem. Why are we in this situation sort of in the first place? Well, we know that AAA and other industry groups have been going back to Congress requesting additional monies. We know that there's that 2, 3, and 22.6% add-on payment that expires every few years. We have already filed the bill to extend that, but what we always get is battles with the various legislative folks about the fact that they're convinced that the current Medicare fee schedule already covers our cost. And in the past, that's been supported on some level by the GAO reports that were released in 2007 and 2013. Those reports, respectively, 2007 said that our costs were somewhere between 6 and 16% below cost without the add-on payments. And the 13 report, which was done completely differently than the 7 report, which doesn't really make sense, but in any event, said that it was a negative 1% margin without the add-on payments. That being said, the GAO reports were sort of flawed in the sense that the only people who participated in those GAO reports were those who voluntarily provided their data. And what we feel pretty strongly about are the only people that would participate in a voluntary cost collection piece or a survey would be people who had somebody sitting around in a financial role that had nothing else to do, possibly would be maybe your larger ambulance or private equity backed groups, which we know is not really representative of what it costs a lot of providers in this country to provide service. So we believe those are flawed. What essentially CMS or what the legislature said to us is, look, if you want us to increase or continue those add-on payments, which by the way have been add-on payments since 1999 when the fee schedule was enacted. So to me, they're not really add-on payments. It's just the fee schedule with some fairy tale of an idea of what of what the fee schedule actually is. what they said was, we want to see data, and they wanted formal cost reporting in the same way that hospitals cost report. But one of my concerns with that is, of course, that hospitals have entire departments of people, 5, 10, 15, 20 people who are doing cost reporting because it is so detail oriented. And for those who are in healthcare, who are CPAs and other accounting types, like I know Amy on this group is, you're familiar with how challenging that is. And when you take a look around the country at how many of our EMS providers are, we know that they don't necessarily, the executive director also happens to be the CQI manager, also happens to be the HR manager, also happens to be the finance person. So there isn't always an entire department. And so what we know is we wanted something different, something that was going to be a lot easier for folks to do. And this, believe it or not, is the watered down version of what CMS wanted. We know that there were a pretty substantial flaws in prior efforts. And we also know, by the way, that they did not want to invent something completely new for us. So the fact that we got something that was different than what every other Medicare provider does is pretty unusual or really remarkable, right? Because we are less than 1% of the total national healthcare expenditures in this country. So ambulance represents less than 1%, 0.83% of the total national healthcare expenditures in this country. Now, as of last, and this slide needs to be updated, as of last, the last Medicare file that was available, what we know now is that 90.1% of the ambulance providers in this country bill less than 2,500 trips a year. 90.1, which means a supermajority of the ambulance providers are small, rural, and super rural providers. 75% bill less than 1,000. So that means that most of the folks that probably participated in those GAO studies were not representative of 90% of this country. Cost collection is going to be critical. Now, I've had some people go, whatever. What I'll tell you is we are not going to get any sort of payment reform without it. And so we believe that it is critical to, because as the government looks at ways to spend less and less and less money, they are looking to us or anywhere, even though we're budget dust, it means that we don't have a lot of weight to swing around in the halls of Congress. So what I will say to you is, we think that this is, given that it has been over 20 years since the last time they reformed the Medicare fee schedule, we believe it is probably the last time that any one of us, although I'm generalizing because I don't know how the ages of folks on here, but I will tell you that for me, if it's another 20 years, I will not be still doing this. I don't think. What I will say is we think that data, every single time we have gone to Congress or gone to any regulatory body asking for things, or even asking for permission, such as things that happened during the pandemic, we were told, well, we don't have any data from you guys. And so we need this data in order for us to be able to continue those innovations, things like treatment in place, telehealth, other innovations that we've seen. We know, right, again, it's that trust but verify. While we believe we play an incredibly important, cost-effective role, including being a safety net provider for individuals in this country, really, there's nothing in the data that suggests that's true. And we can't prove it. We can't put our money where our mouth is. So even if you were not one of the individuals who was picked, 50%, and we'll talk about this in a second, were picked to collect their data in this year, 50% next year, you need to be engaged. We do believe, or we're at least hopeful, that what this will help us, fix or correct will be some of those below cost reimbursements. We know unreimbursed cost for things like those safety net provider, all of those patients that we move that we don't get reimbursed for. We also think that this is an important opportunity for like when they change the regulatory requirements for ambulances by requiring that there be a new stretcher mounting system, or when there are unfunded mandates across many, many states, like my state, that have required, certain pieces of equipment that are not provided additional reimbursement. And so if we're able to show, for example, that there was a year that EpiPens went absolutely insane and those costs were not being reimbursed by anybody, we believe that this is a step that will provide us the opportunity to be able to do that. Because I will tell you right now, despite the fact that there was there were tons and tons of stories about the EpiPen issue and the pricing, That never translated to how it impacted us, even though we may have barked in someone's corner. We didn't have any data to prove it. So what I would suggest is this is a really wonderful opportunity for us to essentially prove, to show the weight and the weight that this profession and these industry providers carry in the overall healthcare scheme. Now, you can choose not to participate. It is absolutely okay. You don't have to. Here's what I will tell you. One, Medicare has decided if you don't participate, guess what? You're going to get a 10% reduction in all Medicare reimbursement for the following calendar year. So if you decide not to, and you bill $1 million a year to Medicare, just know they're going to reduce that by 100,000, 10%, right? So what I would say is that's one problem. The other problem is that not only may it result, not only will you get that 10% reduction, it may also result in reductions in the overall fee schedule, right? Because we are going to be judged in an aggregated way amongst all of the providers. And if we have a holistic lack of participation in cost collection, what will happen is only those who can, who can easily produce that data, generally those who are probably your lower cost providers, are going to submit their data. And as a result, it will look like the costs are actually much cheaper than they are, which will result in a reduction in the fee schedule or an elimination of those add-ons. Additionally, what we know, those add-ons, again, what may happen, right? What message does it send when we've been begging Congress for years and years to continue, or to either continue those add-ons or to give us additional money? And they say, okay, you know what? I'll tell you what, we'll consider it, but you have to do data. And then 60% of the industry does not even respond to a data collection process. Now, there could be all of the most wonderful reasons in the world why that is, but truthfully, the message it will send to Congress is they don't need it. They don't want it. They don't need it. They don't care. What I will say is you absolutely have to participate. And while I know that there are a group of folks on this presentation, either virtually or there with Kim and Tim, what I will say is you probably each know 4 or 5 ambulance service directors or folks who are not engaged because they just don't engage for lots of reasons. Some of them could be good reasons or bad reasons, right? They're too tied up actually working the calls, or they just don't believe that it's going to ever make a difference. What I would tell you is they will be right if they don't participate. It will not make a difference if they don't participate. So please engage those folks now. We could see a whole bunch of bad stuff occur because we don't engage and participate in cost collection. Now, originally what the schedule was 1/4 of the providers in this country each year over a course of 4 years reporting. What has happened due to the pandemic and the delay is 50% will be collecting data in 2022, either fiscal or calendar year. We'll talk about that, and reporting in 2023. And then the other 50%. So if you haven't been selected already, you are selected for next year. All right. So 50% selected already should be collecting their data right now, either fiscal or calendar year. And what I mean by that is if you are a fiscal, so if you run calendar year, you're collecting data from January. It is a question. I thought this was mandatory. If you had your MPI selected, it is. And if you fail to, you will suffer a 10% reduction in all Medicare reimbursement, right? So despite the fact that it is mandatory, just recognize the only teeth that Medicare has to make it happen. Well, there's 2 things they could do. They could just pull your Medicare provider number, which frankly would put a whole bunch of people, probably a whole bunch of areas out of an ambulance service, or they can reduce your penalty. So that is their only teeth in this one. So John, you're correct. It is mandatory. But that being said, speed limits are mandatory. So a lot of things are mandatory, but people don't do. Taxes are mandatory, but people don't pay their taxes. So what I will say is I am counting on the fact that we will have a number of folks who just don't engage no matter how hard we try. So if you were calendar year 2022, you will collect your data from January 1 through December 31st of 2022, and you will report your data no later than May of 2023. If you are fiscal year, let's say your fiscal year starts in July, you will start collecting your data in July 1st of 2022. You will continue to collect your data all the way through June of 23. June 30th of 23, and you will report your data 5 months later, November of 2023. All right, so just understand that what will happen is we'll collect that data 5 months after your data collection period has expired. You will then have an obligation to submit that data. You can submit it earlier, but you can submit that data anytime up to 5 months after. And then there originally was a report due to Congress in May of 2023, which was sort of asinine because they really wouldn't have had a chance to analyze any of that data, but they have delayed that. We haven't gotten the new date yet. So a lot of folks say, all right, Scott, I get it. I buy it. I already know that we should be doing it. Now let's talk about, what does this mean? How should I do it? So I always bring up these sort of top 5 areas of confusion that a lot of folks have, and we'll hit this as we move along, but I want to just emphasize them right now. All right, they're interested in, as you start to track labor, which is the large section 7, the largest section of this entire process, you will have to take a snapshot of your staff at the beginning of the collection period. So if you're a calendar year you're selected running on a calendar year, you will take a snapshot on January 1 of 22 of all of your staff. Now, if Scott starts the year as an EMT, but in May becomes a paramedic, I'm still going to track all of Scott's wages and hours as an EMT. This doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever, because it would be so much easier for us just to say, give me all my paramedic hours, give me all my paramedic wages, give me all my EMT hours, give me all my EMT wages. But this is the way that Medicare has done it. If you have an employee that starts in March as an EMT, but in May becomes a paramedic, you're going to snapshot him or her as an EMT for the whole period. They just have decided this is the way they're going to go. I'm not quite sure why. So take a snapshot at the beginning of the period. They are asking, or they have, make sure that you understand that there's a definition. Labor is put into 3 chunks or 3 categories. People working in one, they're either EMT response staff, they're administrative or facility staff, or they are a medical director. All right, one of those 3 categories. Now, what the confusion is in many agencies, everyone that works in the department, whether it's the chief, the deputy chief, whether it's the CQI person, everyone tends to be certified, and they all tend to respond to calls. If somebody responds to a call once during the year, to a ground ambulance call once during the year, all of their hours and wages will be reported in the EMT responder category. That's just the way they want to do it. It may result, like in my fire department, there was only one person who was administrative, and that person did the payroll. Outside of that, everybody else, fire chief, she was a paramedic and she responded to ground ambulance calls all of the time. So what I will say is it may very well look like, geez, we don't have anybody working in the administrative facilities section. We understand that. CMS says they understand that, and they're going to have a way to allocate that. Time on task and response. This comes back to, and particularly important for areas where you have long transport times, because in a lot of agencies, I know when someone calls clear the hospital, their put is available, even though technically they're still 80, 90, 60 minutes away from their service area. It's important that as we're measuring total time on task, that you are including the deadheaded time back to your service area so that they can respond. So the way it's defined is from the time they receive the call to the time that they're back in service and ready to respond to a call in your service area. So it's important that if you don't already have some mechanism, either a practice and dispatch to capture that, yes, we're clear, but we're returning, so you have a status where you can calculate that, or making sure your folks know that they have to call back into the service area so you can capture that, because that really does go to cost. I have a good friend who runs a service in Missouri. They have a 90-minute transport time. It's in Lincoln, Nebraska. It's a 90-minute deadhead time back. No matter what, if they go to Lincoln, Nebraska, their call time is at least 3 hours. All right. And you want to get credit for that because that goes back to cost. Shared expenses, and we'll talk a lot about that today. If you are an organization, you are a multi-functioning department, you're a fire that also does EMS, or police that all does EMS, or you're in all hazards, then you are going to have to allocate costs as it relates to ground ambulance versus those other functions, and we'll talk about that. And if you have more than one NPI, it is entirely possible. Like I got a question last week. Hey, we have multiple NPIs and we found out we got selected for both. That can happen, right? You can get selected. If you have two NPIs, you could report in both years for each NPI, and you have to allocate expenses according to each NPI. If you have two NPIs, you could have both NPIs selected in the first year or in the second year. You still have to allocate expenses per NPI. There are a lot of reasons people have multiple NPIs. They pull out their wheelchair van because they want that in a separate NPI. That makes your life easy. Wheelchair van is not ambulance. And there could be reasons, by the way, you might want to extinguish or get rid of or relinquish an NPI if you haven't, if you really decide, geez, we don't want to have to split those costs up, and there's really no reason for us to do it. We're just see if we can eliminate one of those NPIs and have the whole organization be represented by one. So I'll just pause there for a second, because I don't know that I've actually taken a breath yet, but pause there for a second to see if you guys have any questions before we move forward. And I can't really see the room because the camera's still pointed at the door. So Kim, maybe if you make a noise, it'll swing back over the other way, but
Ginger's got one here, hang on.
okay. Yeah, that camera's not moving, but that's all right.
How are people or agencies identified as 2022 or 2023? Like if you don't hear, you didn't get selected for 2023?
That's a good question. So I've had a lot of people. So on the CMS webpage, and I'll share that page with you in a few minutes. If you type into Google or whatever your search engine is, CMS ambulance resource page or ambulance resource center, you'll find there a link to, you'll see cost collection, and you'll see a link to two zip files. One says year one, one says year two. Right now, those are the only two that have been selected, because that was back. Why they haven't merged these two files, I don't know, but those are the folks that have been selected. Don't search by your agency name or by state. Search by NPI, because we found in some instances, for example, my fire department was like, oh, we didn't get picked. They're billing agents in another state. And as a result, for some reason, when CMS pulled their information, they listed them as being in another state. And so my chief was like, oh, we didn't get picked. And then I pulled in the NPI. I'm like, oh yeah, you did. It's just listed in a different area. So incorrectly. What I would suggest is go to that, follow the link, and I've got the slides. I just saved them right before we started so I can send them to Kim. You can follow that link or just go into Google. You can do it while you're in the presentation here and just type in Ambulance Resource Center CMS. You'll find the thing, and or if not, you can email me and I'll search it for you. I'm more than happy to do that. And if you're not on one of those two lists, which is totally disconcerting, right? Because I don't like just going, well, I must not be selected because I haven't heard anything. Just so you know, we had many, many people who never got a letter. Their billing agent got a letter, but they didn't know it. The billing agent didn't even, and by the way, your billing agent can't do this for you necessarily. They may offer to do it for you, and that's fine, but we should talk about that. So I'm more than happy to look it up for you, but if not, you can just go to the CMS webpage. Oh, look at that. Amy Gonek is kindly dropped, or I should say Noyek, I think is how it's more properly pronounced. My apologies. Has kindly put that link into the chat for those who want to just follow it. You can follow that link. And it is hyperlinked on this in this slide presentation. So we will find out for you. One of the things that you do have to do once you've been selected is notify your MAC, whether you're on a calendar or a fiscal year. If you haven't already done so, they're going to default you to a calendar year. You probably, based upon the delay, can still contact your MAC and let them know, hey, we're actually on a fiscal year, because it would be a real pain in the butt if you are on a fiscal year and you got forced to do calendar. What I would suggest for you is to contact your MAC. You still have to notify them whether you are or you aren't. And many MACs have already, I've talked to people more recently who've said their MAC was perfectly fine with them notifying them this late in the game. So you're supposed to notify within 30 days. Medicare said that they sent out letters to every single selected agency, but I heard from define MAC. Good question. Your Medicare administrative contractor. So it's the insurer who has contracted with CMS to process your claims. So it could be NGS, could be a whole bunch of Palmetto. There are a whole bunch of truthfully, I can't remember who Colorado has. I'm sure somebody on here remembers. Does fiscal year mean federal fiscal year or our agency's fiscal year? Good question. It is your agency's fiscal year. So if your agency runs a fiscal year from February to November, then you run off of your own fiscal year. That's perfectly fine. It's not the federal. So thank you, Amy. For Colorado, the MAC is Novitas. So that's who you would notify. And you can just, most people have a representative they've spoken to before. And if you tell them you're calling to talk about your cost collection and find somebody there, I'm sure that there's a champion there that can help you. And if you run into any real problems, reach out to Brian Werfel or I from the AAA, and we will track that down. That being said, and I know, I don't have any financial interest here, but I will say that Amy has been, is a long time, is a CPA and has been a long time EMS person. She's a pretty good resource. If you ever, if you ever needed assistance with this, Amy and I are to work together on the SAVIC Foundation board. And, she's one of those people that I might push you towards if you called me. So just to give you a heads up, there is help. Don't try and tackle this alone. So good questions. Any other questions before we move forward? All right. I don't see anything. All right. So section 2. So section 1, this is a 13 section tool. Section 1 is all instructions, right? So that part's nice and easy. The instructions are lengthy. If you want to look at the tool itself, you can go onto that same ambulance resource page and pull down the PDF version of the tool. Make sure you have the version that's dated in 2022. It's down in the bottom left-hand corner. You will see a date. I think it's July of 2022. That's the most recent one. They just made some technical corrections and those kind of things to clarify. So section 2, and understand the way this whole thing is supposed to work. So the tool is going to be electronic. The PDF version that you're going to see has a lot of bracketed and bolded text. That's to sort of walk you through the skip logic that this tool is going to use. So skip logic is essentially a tool used from an electronic perspective that when you answer a question a certain way, it will then direct what your next questions are. Like if yes, then answer this. If no, then proceed to this. It will do it automatically. So if you say, we are a private, nonprofit, standalone EMS agency, right, then you will not see questions about public safety. If you say, we are a fire-based EMS agency, then you will see questions moving forward relative to allocating time and or for those responses that have nothing to do with ground ambulance. So this section here where you fill out these questions are intended to set you up for really the rest of the survey, because we want to make sure when we analyze data, you want the data to be analyzed in the same bucket with people who are similar to you. If you are a small, super rural ambulance service, do you want to be compared from a cost perspective to AMR? Probably doesn't make any sense. If you're a fire-based EMS agency, it probably doesn't make any sense to compare you to a private for-profit service, right? I know in my fire department, we buy ambulances that are at least $200,000. I don't really know why, but we just do. And so I know that those costs are significantly higher than, let's say, a private ambulance service might be. You want to be able to get credit for that. And CMS needs to know that, because when it comes down to the fee schedule, they're going to base any reform in that fee schedule on these costs. So the responses in this section will set up the rest of the tool. They do want to know, does your agency bill for ground ambulance? If you say no, guess what? Survey's over, you're all done. It's going to ask the type of ownership that you have, the number of NPIs that you might have. They will ask for an organizational contact. I don't believe there'll be any auditing in this process, but then again, you know what they say, data is like trash. If it's going to be collected, you sure as heck better know what someone's going to do with it. And what I'm not completely convinced about is when the federal government collects, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but when they collect data, I will tell you, I promise you, they're planning on doing something with it, probably beyond just simply reforming our payment fee schedule. They will ask you whether you report on a fiscal or a calendar year. Then they will ask you which best describes you. Are you a for-profit, a not-for-profit, but not governmental? Are you governmental, or are you some form of a public-private partnership? All right, that again helps make sure that you end up in the correct bucket, right? Once you then move from there, all right, if you choose a certain type of, if you say that we are a governmental, it is then going to ask you, are you a fire department, a police or other public safety agency? You will go through and ask you further questions so that they can set up the tool to make sure that you are attributing and or allocating costs that might not be related to ground ambulance. What CMS really wants here is only costs related to the provision of ground ambulance services. So if you're a hospital-based or a flight-based EMS system, you are going to need to pull any costs tied to your hospital out. You're going to need to pull any costs tied to your air out. So if you have paramedics who some days get in a helicopter and other days get in an F-350, well, the days they're in the F-350, we want to know about. They want to know about. The days they jump in the helicopter, guess what? They do not care about those. So you're going to need to allocate. All right. So just so we understand, what we're looking for are those expenses that are shared and those expenses that are solely for the provision of ground ambulance services. Not interested. If you have someone who does fire inspections and never responds to a ground ambulance call, I don't want to know anything about it. All right. So section 3 and section 4 get to response times. And so this comes down to, again, response times have everything to do with the cost and the provision of ambulance services. So they want to know a couple of things. One, they want to know what your primary service area is, which is the area in which you are primarily responsible for providing services, and for which the majority of, do we have a question?
No.
Okay, sorry, heard something, and and with my bad ears at 53, I sometimes think that it's a question. So your primary end is also the area where the majority of your ambulance responses should occur, or your pickups should occur. So it is possible that more than one, like in the city of New York, there are multiple ambulance services in the city of New York. And so multiple people can say that their primary service area is, let's say, the Bronx. That's perfectly fine. What they want to know is what's your primary response area. Your secondary service area is that area for which it is outside of your primary area. And these are going to be identified by zip codes. It's the area outside of your primary service area, but we're not looking for instances in which you respond to FEMA. Let's say if you were activated as a result of this latest hurricane and got sent down to Florida, we're not interested in that. Or you were activated by the governor in Colorado to go to a mass casualty or a large scale disaster event. We're not looking for that. What we're looking for is your secondary service area, or those areas in which you provide response outside of your primary service area through auto aid or mutual aid agreement. All right. So really looking for those areas where are outside of your primary service area, but are not those disaster responses. So what do you do if there's some overlap? That's going to happen, right? In other words, you share zip codes. Well, that's pretty straightforward. All right. It is okay if you list both zip codes. And I know this sounds wacky, but understand it is okay if your primary area is in a zip code, or if you share that zip code. Let's say your primary service area is part in zip code 1 and part in zip code 2, list it. If your secondary service area is part, is all of zip code 2, well, that's okay. You can list that too. The tool is going to allow you, we've seen a beta test of the tool, which was developed by the RAND company. And a few of the faculty members participated in the beta test. What we found is that you have the ability to be able to multiple select now. So you'll just shift control and select more than one. In Amber, you can either select by shift control multiple selections, or you can just go to a map and draw in your service area, and it will auto populate all of the zip codes in the service area that you were in. Now, that's getting at, where am I responsible primarily to respond? And then where do I respond as a result of mutual aid or auto aid as a secondary area? Because again, that comes back to cost. Next is your ground ambulance service volume. So what we're looking for are, what are the total responses for your agency, regardless of whether a ground ambulance was deployed or a patient was transported. All right. Then what they want to know is what's your ground ambulance response volume. So the number of times that you received a request for service for which you actually rolled a ground ambulance response. And what we mean by ground ambulance is the Medicare's definition. So if you have in my state, Class 5 ambulance could be a Ford Bronco, or I say Ford Bronco, actually they're back now, so I can say that, or an Explorer. Explorer can't probably transport a patient, so that's not an ambulance as defined by Medicare. What we mean by ground ambulance is a fully equipped and staffed ground ambulance, scheduled or unscheduled, with or without a transport, with or without payment. And this is the tricky part. If more than one ambulance is sent to a scene, then you will count that as one response. So if you get a request for multiple victims at a car accident, and you roll 3 ambulances and you only transport 1 patient, they call that one response. I don't like it, but that's how they want it done. And so it's important that you recognize and have the ability to track that. Now, if you roll 3 ambulances and transport 2, that's 2 responses. If you roll 3 ambulances and transport 3, that's 3 responses. Okay, so just recognize if you empty the barn and you only and you don't transport anybody, that's 1 response. All right, if you empty the barn and you transport 1, it's just the way that they've defined it. I'm not sure why. I'm sure somebody way smarter than me came up with this idea, and that's what they want to do. So ground ambulance transports, those are the times. So each will be a subset of the other, right? So total responses is the whole circle. Ground ambulance responses is a smaller circle. Your ground ambulance transports should be a smaller circle, right? Those are the number of times that you responded to ground ambulance and then you transported somebody. And then your paid ground ambulance transports hopefully will be the same size as the ground ambulance transports, but it could very well be or should likely will be a smaller subset of those transports for which you got paid. And what they mean by that is, if you got paid $1 on a ground ambulance transport, what they want is for you to report that as a paid transport. In the aggregation of data, that will play itself out so that you end up, it'll show just a lower overall average per transport reimbursement. All right, so just as an example of that, right? If total responses are 1,000, I send a fire truck only, or 300, I spent a fire truck and a ground ambulance to 350, and I spent a ground ambulance to 350. That's your 1,000. All right, if I send a ground ambulance response, if I sent a fire truck and a ground ambulance and then for 350, and then ground ambulances to 350, I'd have 700 ground ambulance responses. If then the subset of that were when I sent 350 ground ambulance, where I sent 350 fire trucks and ground ambulances, but resulted in 100 transports, and I sent 350 ground ambulance, which resulted in 300 ground ambulance transports, I have 400 ground ambulance transports. And then the final subset of that again is, of those, if I had 75 for which I got some remuneration or some payment for, or 275 that I got some payment for of those ground ambulance responses, then I will have 350 paid transports. Any questions on that?
You have one in the chat.
Okay. If you went to an MCI, pulled 3 ambulance, transported 6, how does that count? So you took 2 in each ambulance. Do I have that correct? So interestingly, you should have what would be 3 ground ambulance responses, but 6 transports. Does that make sense? Just I'm waiting for the response. I think so, hopefully. I don't see any response. So I will presume, I'll presume we're okay. All right. If not, Arlen, just go ahead and please let me know. So we can keep, we'll keep rocking and rolling, but I'll keep an eye on the chat. Thank you for keeping an eye on the chat as well, Kim. They're going to ask you about one ambulance, one in one ambulance, 3 in 2 ambulance. So one ambulance in one in one ambulance, I think is what that says. 3 in 2 ambulances, I think is what, oh no, oh, 1 in ambulance 1, 3, 2, it doesn't matter. Here's what I'll tell you. If you responded 3 ambulances, but you transported 6 patients, you have 3 ground ambulance responses, 6 transports. Okay.
Harlan just stacks them like cordwood.
Yeah, right. Well, and you know, you can see some of those, like if you look at Matt Zavatsky's multiple transport vehicle, you stack them like cordwood. I like it. You'll see that there are instances in which they respond 1 ground ambulance, right? If that big monster bus equals ground ambulance, but that they have multiple folks, you know, stacked up on there, hanging in cots. It's you just, you know, it's like cool when you go to big services like that and you see all those resources, but then you think, all right, well, for most of the country that they're out in the middle of nowhere, they, you know, or I say nowhere, somewhere, just not as populated as, let's say, Fort Worth is. You know, you look at that and you go, oh my gosh, you know, that you can't even swing that vehicle around some of the areas we were in. All right, so 1 patient in ambulance 1, 3 in ambulance 2, and 3 in ambulance, and 3 in ambulance 2 in ambulance. Yeah, all right. Well, I think I get the point, but either way, I think you're good. 6 people transported, 3 ground ambulance responses. You had 3 responses, 6 transports. Perfect. Standby events, they just want to know how often you're standing by because there is a cost associated with that. Now, paramedic intercepts are one that you all are going to go, we do tons of paramedic intercepts. Paramedic intercept for Medicare purposes only occurs in the state of New York because in the state of New York, certain volunteer agencies are forbidden from billing. And so they call a paramedic service to come in. And what that ends up doing is forcing, because of the Medicare because of their state regulatory language, Medicare recognizes that as a paramedic intercept. Everybody else who intercepts has what's called an ALS joint response. So unless you're in New York, you will not have any paramedic intercepts. Don't ask, just understand if you intercept or you have intercepts, those are ALS joint responses. All right. Brian can usually explain that a little bit better than I am because he's actually from New York. But what I will say is it's just some regulatory language as it relates to New York. Now, as I understand it, there may have been a more recent change that will allow some of those volunteer agencies to start billing. We'll see what happens with that. All right, next in section 6, we're going to talk about service mix. And what we're looking at in service mix is they're trying to get an idea of, all right, what percentage of your responses are emergency and what percentage of your responses are non-emergency, right? And so what they're going to look for as we move through this, they're talking and they define emergency as the same way that Medicare defines emergency, right? And then also will include, like, these emergencies can include transporting someone from an emergency room or from a certified healthcare facility to a facility of higher, you know, because of the patient's condition, they had to be transported to a higher level service. That can be an emergency under Medicare. So just make sure that your systems are set up to capture that. All right. They're looking to understand is how many transports or how many responses and transports did you do during the year? So they will ask you transports by those HIC picks. So transports, these are times when you have billed, all right, by HIC picks. So BLS non-emergency, BLS emergency, ALS 1 non-emergency, ALS emergency. They will ask for ALS 2 emergencies as well as SCTs. Now I noticed the ALS 1 emergency is not in here. We'll have to fix that. So slide 23, sorry about that. We find them all the time. Usually instead of saying donated, somebody had detonated, which sounds like a lot of fun, honestly, but not what it was meant to say. So we fix those errors. So what they're going to ask you basically to do, and this is information you may very well get from your billing company if you use a billing company. If you don't use a billing company, you should be able to pull this out of your system. All right, this is just straight up by HICPIC. What were those transports and what percentage of them were BLS non-emergency, BLS emergency, ALS non-emergency 1, ALS emergency 1, ALS 2, and then SCT. They are going to ask what percentage of your transports or total transports by category, and then they will ask what percentage of those were interfacility as defined by Medicare. So one certified healthcare facility to another. Section 7, and based upon my background, this is the one that is not only the largest section in the tool, but also, as we know, in most agencies, labor attributes to roughly anywhere from 59 to 70% of the total cost of an ambulance service overhead. So this section is the largest. We are only looking for people. We're only going to report labor that are either entirely or partially related to ground ambulance service. So if you're a fire department and you have people who work on your fire trucks who happen to be EMTs that you respond to ground ambulance calls, you're going to include them here. If you have someone who's, as I said, who issues burn permits or is inspectional services or who doesn't ever respond to a ground ambulance call, well, then we're not going to include them there. All right. So this is important that you identify those folks and that you understand, you know, if you have a person who is a dispatcher who jumps onto an ambulance once during the course of a year, that person is going to fall into the EMT response staff category. All right. We're not looking for anybody who might be an independent contractor. There are a lot of people who miscategorize those folks. And from both the DOL perspective and the IRS perspective, that is incredibly problematic. We should talk offline. Labor, as I said before, is divided into 3 main categories. Those categories are EMT response staff, admin facility staff, and medical director. So just to give you an idea of what those groups might look like. All right. Anybody who at any point responded to a ground ambulance call at any point during your data collection year, if they responded, will fit into the EMT response staff category. Your admin facility staff, some people think, oh, it's a dispatcher. They're actually more like an EMS person. Well, even if you have a dispatcher who's certified as an EMT, but who never responded to a ground ambulance call during the course of a year, that person is an admin and facility staff. Your call takers, receptionists, billers, schedulers, fleet maintenance people, if you do your own in-house fleet maintenance, your custodians, your facilities, your vehicle service techs, any logistics, human resources, IT, safety and risk. Right. Those are if they didn't respond to a ground ambulance call and they're not your medical director, they go in this middle category. All right. And then your medical director, whether that person be either employed or whether they be a volunteer. All right. Those are the 3 categories. Now, if somebody started out, if they did one ground ambulance call, they move to the left, they go into the yellow category. All right. If they started out, by the way, as a volunteer person, and then moved over to a paid person, you're going to report them and their wages in that paid category. Okay. So it's important to understand now, there is or are instances in which you're going to need to break these individual categories down from wages and hours into the individual, whether they're an EMT or a paramedic or an EMR. We'll get to that section in a minute. All right. But a good plan is, if you have any way in your system to be able to categorize people for purposes of cost collection, you should. I tried to work with all of the vendors of software, scheduling and billing and dispatch, to try and, like 4 years ago, I reached out to all of them to say, hey, this thing called cost collection, trains coming down the tracks, you can ignore it if you'd like to, but there's going to be a pretty bad wreck. They all could not be bothered, truthfully. Most of them had no interest whatsoever. When I said, hey, you know, I'd love to be able to give a shout out to you because you have a particular category that allows people to designate these things, and they all ignored me because, truthfully, I wasn't a paying customer, so they don't care. But what I would love is if some of these vendors had taken the initiative to go, geez, cost collection, let us help you with that. Because at the end of the day, if agencies end up with more money, they'll have more money to buy their little products. So if a volunteer is paid a stipend, are they paid or volunteer? So they're a volunteer, but you will report stipends, and there's a part in this tool for that. Okay, you will report that as in compensation or total compensation, but we'll show you where that is. All right, so how do you categorize? Right, paid operations director with an EMTP license. If that person never goes to a ground ambulance call, they're admin facility. But if they do, well, guess what? They fall into that EMT paramedic category. If you have a paid basic who volunteers for the organization in another capacity, that EMT is reported in the paid basic category. All right, now If they're volunteering, as we talked about yesterday, that other category better have nothing to do with their primary role. Otherwise, we have to talk. All right. So if they have response duties, if they have EMS response duties, even if it's not their primary role, as I said, they could respond to one flip and call. They don't even have to make patient contact. If they responded and then got canceled before they even got there, which, by the way, is every admin stream, then you will still list them in that EMT response category. Okay. Now, this is a good or a quick example, a few examples, and I don't want to burn a ton of time on these examples because you can read them and you'll have these slides. And by the way, if you haven't already done so, you should sign up for Amber, which then gets you access to all of the ambulance cost collection content. That includes, it's been made available to you through a grant from the SAVIC Foundation, as well as the AAA, in particular, recognizing that rural and super rural agencies data is going to be critically important in this. So it is made available for free to all ambulance providers in this country, whether they be municipal, non-municipal, fire-based, we don't care, right? And I'll tell you why Amber is going to be important in a few minutes, but it is free and available to you. There is an entire ton of content on the Prodigy learning management platform, which is available again to AAA members for them to watch a breakdown of each of these sections. In addition to that, by the way, CMS has done an amazing job, and I don't often compliment federal agencies, but in this instance, they've done an amazing job at putting together content, educational webinars, speaking sessions, FAQs, and resources available for ambulance services to try and help us get this right. We will be judged by the worst submitter of data. So just understand it's going to be aggregated, and if you produce crap, or somebody in your group, if all of you do a great job, but then 5 or 10 people do real junk, it is going to impact us. Jason, what would you suggest we could say to stakeholders who might be concerned about putting their data into Amber? Great, Amber. I just sounded very Boston. Amber. Yeah, I sounded like Jason. I sounded like Matt Damon. Amber. And so the concern will be who else will have access. Great question. So Amber was developed. AAA hired a group called Square Alliance, a software vendor. There is, I read the contract myself. I will tell you there is a firewall between any individually identifiable data. So no one at the AAA will have access to your individually identifiable data. There will be access to aggregated data, and I might as well tackle this now while we're here. The reason we want access to data, there are two things I say about data. Well, I say, and I stole this totally from somebody else. I think one of them may have been Deming, said that data is like trash. If you're going to collect it, you sure as hell better know what people are going to do with it. The other, okay, yep, I will stop in 1 second. The other is that data is also like light bulbs. And the more data you have, the better you can see what's going on around you. What I will tell you is you want the AAA to have that aggregated data. They won't be able to see your data, but they will be able to see aggregated data, because given that data is like trash and you sure as hell better know what people are going to do with it, I'm not confident, by the way, that when this data exercise is done, that number one, what happens if the information in the CMS system is grossly different than the information we have in Amber? We want to be able to go back to CMS and say, we think you might have a problem with your tool. Here, by the way, is the data that we have, right? Because data can be used in both a offensive and a defensive strategy. So if in fact we start to see leading up to the deadline for reporting that the data we're seeing in Amber is concerning, we can start lobbying at that point to lawmakers to be able to, or at least starting to get an idea, can we look at the data, can we get access, can we use these data to compare? So I hear what you're saying. The AAA is not interested in your individually identifiable data, as well as there is that firewall. And I can tell you, near as all of the documentation I read, there was very strict rules that AAA would never have access to individually identifiable information. So the question in the room, Kim.
First one from me, are you going to put the link for Amber in this presentation?
Yep, it's at the end. Yep.
Okay, then Sean?
Any other?
Hello, Scott. Sean Caffrey. Can you hear me from the back?
Yeah,
of the
sure
room?
can. Go ahead.
Excellent. I apologize if you answered this question already, but while you've been chatting, I've been scouring the year 1 and year 2 lists and don't see my agency's name on it. Am I off the hook, or do I need to call somebody?
Well, did you search by NPI?
I searched by NPI, by name, and by state.
Then you're going to be collecting next year, but I'm going to check anyways after we get off just to double check. But yeah, you will be collecting data next year and reporting in 24.
Okay, so plan on year 2.
Plan on year 2. If you do not see your NPI in there, if you've searched both lists by NPI, then you're not selected.
Yeah. All right, thanks.
That doesn't leave you feeling comforted, does it?
Yeah, it's good enough.
No, I'll search after this ends in a half an hour. I'll search and I'll text you back and just let you know. And if anybody else, again, I think, I had shared my email yesterday, but I'm going to share my my cell phone as well. If you want me to search for you, just drop me a text. It's no big deal. I will search for you. The only thing I ask, please either give me the exact spelling of your agency or your NPI, because I'm going to have to go search your NPI. Then I'm going to have to go, then I'll go search the list. I'm happy to do it for you all. If you have to listen to me blab on about anything for any period of time, the least I could do is jump through a hoop or two. So what I'll say is I'm happy to do it. And Sean, if you didn't see you in your NPI in 1 or 2, you're not this year, you're next year. So, and I don't know if you're a calendar year. If you're a calendar year, you should start collecting data in January 1 of 2023. And if you're a fiscal year, whatever the first day of your fiscal year is. All right. Any other questions?
I just have a quick comment. I looked through year 1 and 2, and it appears multiple Colorado agencies are not on the list for year 1 or 2. Because just looking at my surrounding agencies, 2 of them are not on the list. I did the same thing Sean did, sort of by state, look by name. So it looks like multiple Colorado agencies are not even on year 1 or 2.
I'm sorry to say that I caught something about multiple, but I really couldn't hear. And if I go to turn up the volume on my system, I actually have to, believe it or not, I have to shut down the presentation, and I don't want to do that.
He's saying that he looked on the system for both years and several of his neighbor agencies were not on it. And so he's indicating that several Colorado agencies were not selected in year 1 or 2.
Yeah, so they randomly supposedly selected 50% in, they randomly selected 25% when they picked both of those lists, because at the time that they published list 1, we hadn't had the pandemic yet. By the time they published list 2, they thought it was gonna, right? Remember when they passed the Paycheck Protection Act and they thought it was gonna be 8 weeks? It's funny. So they published list 2. They hadn't yet delayed. So they were randomly selecting 25%. Some states were overrepresented. Some states were underrepresented. I don't know if that's, but what I'll do between now and our, what is it, a 4 o'clock, 4:30 session? 4:30 session, I believe, or 4:45. I will go on and pull the agencies that I saw listed for Colorado. And by the way, I'm going to be selecting by state. So if your billing agencies in another state, I might miss you because I can't pull all the NPIs from everybody. But I'll pull the list and I'll email it to Kim. And then maybe what I'll do is I'll add it into just an additional slide at the end of the recruitment one that just shows who I see as listed, if that's helpful at all.
Thank you.
So I think some of the confusion is, am I right that if you're listed on either year 1 or year 2, you're collecting data this year?
Correct.
And if you're not, then you're collecting data next year.
Correct.
Originally, it was going to be over a 4-year period, and then they condensed it down to 2 years.
You are 100% correct. Right. So yeah, they originally the plan was 25% would collect in a year, report the following year, collect in a year, report the following year. But when the pandemic came and sort of blew all that up, they said, you know what? They wanted to have 3/4 of the industry report, collect this year and report next year. And we were like, look, we still think that there are impacts from the pandemic that are going to show or influence that data in a way that's not going to be representative of the true costs. And we think it would be wiser for you to, what we asked for was them to push the whole 4 years out, but they wouldn't do it. They were like, no. So we had a little temper tantrum, and then we were able to get them to split it 50-50. So yeah, so the reason and why they haven't consolidated the 2 lists now is beyond me, because I think it just adds to confusion. But you know, as I said, I left the United States Department of Labor, and I'm going to guess that CMS is not all that different, although my interactions with CMS have been outstanding in this regard, with the folks and the willingness of leadership to listen to the industry. And the engagement that they have done is beyond any outreach I've seen by any agency in the federal government so far. And I'm not pretending to have a lot of interaction with the federal government, but what I will say is, you know, if it isn't clear, I've been pretty impressed. This algorithm, we like algorithms in EMS. And by the way, any other questions, Kim? I can see you pretty clearly, so no?
I think we're good.
Okay, good. So this algorithm, this is just an easy way. If you're not sure, you know, look at your list of employees. And if you're not sure, just go through this algorithm, right? Did they have ground ambulance responsibilities? If the answer is no, they're not in it. All right. If they did have ground ambulance responsibilities, were they paid? No, they're on the volunteer side. And then you follow that down. All right. It's pretty straightforward. I don't want to beat this up, but we can revisit it if anybody has any challenges. Then you are going to find, at least this is what we're told in the tool, you're going to find an area where you are going to, and depending upon whether you're fire-based or not fire-based, you will either see references to fire, but we presumed that, just for purposes of this to be more inclusive, we presumed we would show both. So you're going to then go through and just click off a checklist. If you're a BLS only service, that's it. Well, then you click off EMT basic, right? Without or with, volunteer or paid, whatever you check off, and then you will not see any other questions about intermediates, paramedics, nurses, EMRs, etc. Just check off whatever one of these applies. And then from there, using skip logic, you will see questions that you will have to answer based upon that. If you're a non-fire-based EMS agency, non-public safety, and non-governmental, and you see questions about governmental stuff, you've probably answered something wrong earlier in the tool and you need to go back, okay? And my understanding is that there is the ability to go back, because you are going to be able to stop and save. But what I will say is you won't be able to stop and save halfway through a section of the tool. Now, CMS has kindly done a study, according to them, and they believe that cost collection will only take about 23 hours. I think that's absolute nonsense. Again, I think it's nonsense. But so how do you track those? As we said, if you're a mixed agency, right, you have people who do both hospital, air, or fire, or other public safety, right? Their total hours you are going to report, but then you're going to allocate what degree of those hours were related to ground ambulance service. All right. So hours are tracked one way, compensation is tracked another. And just so we're clear, when we're talking about hours, those are hours worked. All right. And that can be volunteer hours as well. So if you're a volunteer agency and you haven't had any tracking of hours for your volunteers, I've got some bad news for you, especially if we are 10 months into the year and you're a calendar year agency. We are going to have to track hours for your volunteers, because there is a cost with those hours. It's just your volunteers bear those costs. So it's important that you're tracking those hours. And there are ways to do that. You can either do that because you're doing, like my fire department, when the tone goes off till the all clear, that's fine. So you just want to make sure that you are tracking those hours. PTO, if you're a paid agency, and let's say every year I get 80 hours of vacation time, and I take that 80 hours of vacation time, you're not going to report PTO or sick time in hours. You will track that time in wages or compensation, because in fact, it's not hours worked. And in fact, it's not really hours worked for the purposes of cost collection. Oop, I bounced forward one too many. So here you are going to reach a section where, based upon the type of agency you are, you're just going to complete the info. What were their total compensation for paid EMT response staff? What were their total number of hours worked for the paid EMT response staff? And of the total hours worked annually, what were related to ground ambulance service? Now, I know that people are going to go, geez, well, we're a fire-based agency, and my EMT response staff includes those people who are EMTs that, on fire trucks that respond to ground ambulance calls. All right. If your fire department is, responding 75% to ground ambulance calls, you may say, okay, Scott works 100 hours in the calendar year. And the total, here's his compensation. His hours are 100 hours, and the total, or the percentage, or the number of hours that can be allocated to ground ambulance. If 75% of the responses we do is ground ambulance, then you can say, you can take that and do an allocation method. What I strongly suggest, or you make a document somewhere that shows or provides the justification or the logic behind how you allocate it, right? So if you said, well, we took a look at last year's responses, 75% of our fire-based responses were to ground ambulance calls. So we're going to say that 75 hours of that 100 hours Scott worked in the collection period were in fact attributable to ground ambulance. Now, total hours worked annually related to fire, public safety, or other, right? And for those who don't have public safety responsibilities, like in row 1, you're not going to put anything there. But if they do, right, again, 75 hours. So then in this case, 25 hours would have nothing, would be related to the fire, public safety. Or if out of the 25 hours that I did that were not related to fire, public safety, I might say 15 of those hours were related to fire, public safety, and then maybe 10 of those were related to some other responsibility outside of public safety. So that may seem like a lot. Here's what I'll tell you. It's more important that you get the number of hours related to ground ambulance correct than anything else. All right. So there are, and these we stole right from CMS. There are some for public safety agencies, how you can go through and determine whether somebody is without public safety responsibilities or with. There are fire departments where the people who are on the ambulance are on the ambulance. They don't ever do any fire responsibilities. So those folks, all of their wages and hours can be attributable to ground ambulance. All right. Compensate. Go ahead.
Question.
Yep.
Scott, yeah, Sean in the back of the room again. So on the hours, are you looking to get 100% of the hours in the year? In which case there would be ground ambulance related work, public safety related work, and time they're not doing anything? Or do you just want the time they're actually on ground ambulance calls and the time they're actually on fire calls?
Great question. So if I am a standalone EMS agency, let's just say, and those EMTs are working, a 10-hour shift, and let's say they don't do a darn thing that whole 10-hour shift, that 10 hours is related to ground ambulance calls. All right. So now let's switch it. They're a public safety agency. They work on our engine. So out of the 10 hours, 8 of those hours, there's, 8 of those hours, for ease of math, they spent responding to ground ambulance calls, right? 2 of those hours, or 1 of those hours, they spent doing fire calls. And then 1 of those hours, they, or doing fire responsibilities, right? So here's where I'd say again, if your folks, and what we mean by hours worked annually related to some other responsibility, if we had something that wasn't tied to that either fire or public or ambulance responsibility, let's say they were off doing education, right? Then you might plug that in here. Here's what I'll tell you. If you're a fire-based EMS agency, I don't think there's anything wrong with, hey, my fire department guys or girls work 80% of the calls that we do are ground ambulance calls, and 20% is not ground ambulance calls. I think you're fine in this instance, right, to list 80% of the wages an hour. Or the total compensation you're going to list. You're not going to break out the dollar figure based upon ground ambulance. You're just going to list the total compensation. The hours, I would say, out of a 10-hour shift, 8 were related to ground ambulance, 2 were not. They were related to the public fire, public safety, and leave it at that. So if they're sitting waiting for a call, right, that I would list that in that fire, public safety time. If they're a ground ambulance only entity, then all of their hours, presuming they have to do with ground ambulance, whether it's waiting for a call, responding to a call, cleaning up after a call, those would be related to ground ambulance. Does that help at all?
It does, Scott, thanks. I think I'm a little bit of an anomaly because I have a bunch of people ready to go. And if it's an ambulance call, they go and get the ambulance. And if it's a fire call, they get in the fire truck.
Yep.
Um,
No, that's how
so
my fire department, that's exactly how my fire department was too. The first,
Yeah, and so
there were
it's
two
easy to
people who were,
allocate the time on call, but it's not easy to allocate the downtime.
yeah, so I wouldn't allocate the downtime. Truth. Well,
Okay.
here's what I would do. I think the easiest way to do it, in my opinion, is I would take a look at your responses. And if 80% of the were, or 70 or 60 or whatever the number is, then I would simply allocate their total hours based upon that. Unless, of course, there was some way in which the more specific you can be, the better. But here's what I'll tell you, get it as right as you can, right? In other words, you want to be as accurate as possible. You want to make sure that you're attributing the time related to the provision of ground ambulance calls that you want to make sure you have right. And so if I have, let's just say in the world of hours, it's 100 hours, 80% of what my department and my folks do are ground ambulance, I'm going to attribute 80% of my hours in working hours to ground ambulance. Now, that's for everyone, right? But if I have half of my department only do the ambulance, well, for that half, it's 100% of their hours are attributable to ground ambulance. If the other half, 50% of what they do is attributable, then I'm going to, right? In other words, just like I said, I don't want you going through each person's thing and having to do this like crazy detail oriented, like, hey guys, I need you to start tracking when you're doing ground ambulance stuff. You don't need to do that. And CMS has been pretty clear. They just want to make sure that however you report it, that it is absolutely as accurate as it can be, and that it's not recorded twice, right? So that you're not reporting somebody in two categories, so that you're doubling down the data. Does that make sense?
Scott, for the supplemental reimbursement program here in Colorado, it's based on your CAD. And so it is absolutely, it's the total time on EMS, total time on fire, and that's how they divided it out. This is not based on your CAD data, correct?
No, your response times and stuff will be based on your CAD data. Your time clock information is going to be, what your punched hours will be your total time. And then you can then further from there allocate based upon the work that's been done, right? So if 60% of your work is EMS based, then that's how I would do it. I would not, here's the thing, CMS wants to give you credit while you're waiting for calls, right? They want to give you credit when you're doing the other duties essential to ensure that you can provide ground ambulance calls. So, and they recognize, right? They want to give you credit while you're doing checklists. They want to give you credit while you're cleaning equipment and decontaminating the truck, or when you're, restocking. They're going to give you credit for that. So I think the best method, and what I've been telling agencies to do is, and I'm sure when you talk to folks like Amy, right, who have done accounting in EMS for some time, right, or have done financial modeling and budgeting and that kind of stuff, that you are making you're making allocations towards that. What I would say is, do yourself a favor, probably consult with someone like her, or, it doesn't have to be her, but someone like her. She does happen to know your state. But what I would say is, to the extent that you can, that you can take a look at your information, and let's consider, most of the agencies that I know that are smaller, that are rural or smaller rural agencies that do really understand. You guys are the only place I've ever been when I said, does anybody know what it costs them to do an ambulance call? And like 8 people in the room put out a number down to the penny. So I was like, wow, no one ever has that number. Most people are like, I can't figure that out. So you guys are already likely doing budgets. You're already, you have to know where your money's going. In this instance, then, I think you should be able to do it. So one of the comments that Amy made was, hey, you could use your CAD. Yeah, you absolutely could. So if you're looking at your CAD data and 80% of your volume is ambulance service, then that's the way I'd use the CAD data. Now, I don't know that I would be tracking actual time on task as hours worked, because here's the deal. There's tons of stuff that isn't captured in your CAD punch times that aren't going to reflect what it costs to run ground ambulance service. Like I said, stocking the truck, cleaning the truck, checking the truck out, fueling the truck, all of those things that are related to the provision of ground ambulance services that are not going to be captured in your CAD. But do I think that you can use your CAD for the purposes of creating justifiable and supportable allocations? 100%. And that's absolutely the way I'd be doing it. Is I'd go, okay, we're a combination department, 65 to 70% of what we do is EMS. I'm going to make those allocations, and everybody does everything. I'm going to make those allocations based upon those numbers. And I would list that, and I would write somewhere, hey, because by the way, this is a 2-year thing. I bet you it's an every year thing after this. Just my gut tells me once they start collecting data, they're never going to want to stop. But the other thing I'll say to that is recognize the importance of longitudinally collecting data, right? Is because when something like an EpiPen, major cost spike goes out, we want to be able to quickly, and this is the advantage to an Amber, is that we can quickly go, hey, we're looking at data being submitted by our members or by users of this platform. And what we're seeing is the cost of medications have driven up dramatically. So, and I'm going to keep rocking and rolling because we got about 15 minutes left and we still got a couple of sections of tool to hit. Actually, we got 6, but thankfully the rest of them are not too bad. So there are some examples on how to break that out, right? And I'm not going to go through each one of them because I think these are easy enough that when I send those slides to you, you can break them down. And what I'd say to any of you is if you have questions about this, you just email hello@ambulance.org. It goes to one of the 12 or 13 of us who are out there doing this stuff, and we'll be happy to answer it for you. That's super easy and quick. So here's one way in which you can break that down, right? So you start to understand reporting compensation. Same with hours, so that you can break down those hours and how you can understand, okay, what are related to ground ambulance versus what might not, reporting hours and compensation. Again, same with those for those fire-based shared services model. How could you break that down? This comes back to some of the things that we were just talking about. I think, again, there are multiple ways you could do it. I don't know that there's one right way, but if you're not sure, like I said, just reach out. We'll be happy to talk to you about that and why or how you may want to do that. All right. It's important you understand, and I know I've covered all this, so I'm not going to burn a lot of time on this particular slide, but we're not looking for information on air ambulance. We're not looking for if your people were out doing shots for COVID or something like that. Those are not supposed to be captured. That's not typical ground ambulance activity. All right. Community education, community paramedicine, again, that's information that they have said that they're not looking for those costs because those are different. That being said, to the extent that you can peel those costs out, let's say, for example, you have a frontline truck that occasionally goes out and does community paramedicine, you're going to have to figure out how to peel that into the all other non-ground ambulance activities. And I know that this group has some of that. So there are volunteer hours that you're going to have to report. Again, we talked about that. If you're not, if you're an agency that's never tracked volunteer hours, you're going to have to come up with a way to do that because, again, understand volunteerism is dropping off pretty dramatically. There is a cost and somebody else is bearing it. And unfortunately, it's the employee or the volunteer. So again, same kind of example relative to volunteer and volunteer hours, those related to ground ambulance and those that are not. And, you were looking, the volunteers, of course, include administrative and other personnel, medical directors, et cetera. If they volunteer, your medical director may not be totally psyched about having to track their time, but to the extent that they can track their time, that's what you need them to do. All right, now we're not talking about the medical director whom you write a check to a particular affiliate medical hospital for provision of oversight. That's different. That'll be recorded in one of the other expenses. This is if you have a medical director who is an employee or a volunteer for your organization. All right. Here is where we talk about, right, compensation can include, right, those stipends, honoraria, allowance, and other compensation. Okay. You are going to report that here. So despite the fact that you've said, that they're volunteers, you will report that those stipends, honoraria, or other allowances in there. Now, if you happen to pay some expense that let's say is global, you're paying workers' comp or something like that, or some, other expense that you're sort of globally doing it, you don't necessarily have to report that there. You can report it in another section of the tool, but don't report it in both. All right. If a volunteer person changes from volunteer to paid, you're going to report them in the paid category. And understand you don't have to report it. They're volunteering for, let's say they volunteer for you, or they paid for you, but they volunteered another ambulance service back in their home, where their home is. You're not doing that stuff, right? You're not tracking that. All right. Yep.
Good question on medical directors.
Okay.
So there are some services in Colorado where medical director hours are provided by a different entity, like UC Health or Penrose. So they pay for those hours. And then there are some agencies that get some of those hours volunteered or paid by somebody else for a lot of the medical direction hours, but the agency will also pay that medical director for additional hours, for additional work. How is that going to be recorded?
So, well, you're going to certainly record any hours that you're paying for. And then if somebody else is, so let's say you have oh God, that's a tough one, a county run hospital, and you are a county run EMS agency. Then in that instance, let's say your specific agency is paying for a portion of those hours, and then the county hospital is paying for the other portion. You need to go and get the cost from the county for those other hours. If in fact, go ahead.
Are those in two separate buckets to be able to get to the total?
Nope.
So in other words, if I have a total of 10 hours of medical direction hours, 8 of those hours are paid by UC Health, and 2 of those hours are paid by me. In that one bucket, I'm still allocating 10 hours, but I'm not breaking out who's paying for what.
Well, so let me ask you, UC Health, is that the same? Are you the same legal entity?
No.
Okay, so then those are hours that you did not pay, and they're only looking for hours that you actually paid for. And when they mean you, what I mean by that is, let's say, for example, let's just treat it like, it would be the equivalent to saying, like, what I mean by you is, if I'm a municipal agency and I don't have an HR, I'm a fire department EMS agency and I don't have HR in my fire department. The town's paying for it. Well, I'm really owned by the town. The NPI is issued to the town, right? Not per se, or the agency's owned by the town. I have to get those hours for the town. But if UC Health is paying it and you're not paying those hours, and you're not coming out of you and UC Health are not related, then those hours are not your hours. They're not you. You don't have to report those. Now, if they're working 10 hours, but somebody else is compensating for those, well, you in fact will report what you have, because your true cost for the 10 hours are whatever you paid. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does, but you're not accounting for the full cost.
I agree. So one
Because
could
that's part of
argue,
the-
if you wanted to count or try and track those as a donated value, you could track, one could argue that as donated time, and you could then try and include that in donations. And there is a section for that in revenue.
Okay.
Make sense? And I know, guys, I've got news.
Yeah.
There's no way we're going to get through these slides in 6 minutes unless I talk like the end of an insurance company. So
We'll do it.
all right. Allocating expenses. All right. So we're looking again, shared expenses. And then of course, those that are entirely ground ambulance, and then those shared expenses we're going to be tracking, right? I don't want anything that's not tied to ground ambulance. All right. So I'm going to blast through these because I want to get to the actual sections regarding facilities. You're going to list your facilities, whatever those names are, you list them. Do you own them? Do you pay rent, or do you pay a lease? Do you own them by paying a mortgage or interest or other payments? Do you own it outright? Was the facility donated? What's the square footage of that facility? And then what percentage of that facility is utilized for the provision of ground ambulance services? This is pretty straightforward. Once you put these names in, they stay there forever. All right. So if you check that you pay lease payments, and you're going to list the square footage and the percentage of that, you are then going to list what you paid later on in that same area later on in the tool. Now you can allocate in multiple ways, right? And the more you can allocate, so if, let's say, for example, big red trucks take up a lot of space, so your ambulances are going to take up considerably less space. So you may allocate 80% of the garage to fire, 20% to ambulance. But when you get into the staff break room and offices, it's really actually 70% of what this agency does is EMS related. So you just have to make sure you can justify the nature in which you broke it down. If you are able to break down what the EMS part of the whole facility is, then great, you can do that. All right, make sense?
Hey, Scott, any
Yep.
opinion on employee housing that's owned by the agency that paramedics live in?
Yeah, you got any vacancies?
No.
Yeah, because
No,
I like my family, but I think they'd love it if I lived in Colorado. So yeah, those would be, if they're, are they attributed to the ground ambulance provider, you would list that as one of the buildings, right? It'll be one of the locations. If it's in the same location, fine. If it's not in the same location, you list it as a separate entity. Now, if it's used for ground ambulance personnel, then you would list that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, you're the first one I've heard of that. I like it. I like it. If you lease, you're going to list the amount of the lease, and these names will carry over. And if you outright purchased it, if you already owned it and you had no expense, aside from maintenance, utilities, and all that nonsense, then you're going to list that you already own it and you didn't have any expense in that calendar year. If you lease or you're paying, let's say, either lease costs or rental costs or mortgage costs, you're going to list that. Okay. Now, when it comes to facilities, they also want in totality, what were your total insurance costs for the facilities? What were the total facilities costs, maintenance, et cetera? Like, you had any upkeep? What were those total utility costs? What were the taxes? You're going to list what the total amount was. And then if it's a shared service organization, you're going to list what percentage of those are attributable to ground ambulance. Okay. My advice, same allocation method. Okay. Now, if you have multiple NPIs, again, you're going to need to break this out by NPI. They're reporting by NPI. Vehicle costs, you're going to do almost exactly the same way as you did facilities, but you're going to list those vehicles, right? Those that you own versus those that you lease. So they're going to list all your vehicles, and there is in the tool ability to upload a spreadsheet, not in Amber. Amber, you just plug that information in. In the tool, these are two spots where they're going to allow a CSV file upload. But we are hopeful with Amber, number one, that they give us an API. I doubt they're going to do that because the government's wonky about letting people push data into their system. Number two, allow a CSV file upload, which we're hopeful that they will allow us to do one CSV file upload or download from our system that we can then just push to their system so that you don't have to put this information in. Worst case scenario, we will create a report that echoes the way and the layout of that particular tool, and you'll be able to bang that information in 20 hours, right? Just like they said, except for you'll have done 18,000 hours before that. But what we're hopeful for, though, is that it's just one CSV file upload from Amber right into the tool. So you're going to list your vehicles, whatever you use to list those vehicles, use your common identifiers, and then it's going to ask, did this truck transport anybody this year? If the answer is no, all right, then you check that box off. Was the vehicle donated? If the answer was yes or no, you answer that. Was there any annual depreciation expense? And you can use whatever depreciation model you want. It should be, generally accepted accounting principles. They will ask if the vehicle was remounted, and if so, what was the cost to the organization for the remount? All right. That, again, should all be pretty straightforward. Same thing for leased vehicles. Okay. Non-ambulance vehicles, you're going to list all of your owned or leased non-ambulance vehicles. That's okay. So supervisors, QRVs, boats, quads, whatever the heck you got, right? That if it's basically got an odometer on it, you're going to put it on. If it's a boat, you can list that too. That's fine. The tough part with boats is there aren't mileage indicators on them. You just need to do the best you can. So you're going to list the vehicle. You're going to say, was the vehicle used to respond to ground ambulance calls? Yes or no? Then it's going to say what type of vehicle. There'll be a drop-down menu that you can identify what that is. We actually, here again, was this vehicle denoted? I like detonated better, but denoted, you're supposed to say donated. We'll fix that. And so was that vehicle donated? What's the annual depreciation on any vehicle? Was there any loan or loan interest or other costs not reported previously in the tool? and then what share of the vehicle's total mileage was attributable to ground ambulance. All right, same thing for leased vehicles. And I don't know how many of you lease vehicles, but it's probably less common in our group. Then they're going to ask for your total vehicle registration costs, your total vehicle licensing costs, and your total vehicle insurance costs. Again, you've already said what percentage of that vehicle's use is mileage is attributable to ground ambulance. They will do the accounting and the allocation there. All right. They're going to look for the maintenance costs and the fuel costs, and they are going to ask for your total maintenance cost. And then they're going to ask you to break it out in your percentage for ground ambulance, fire, land, water, other vehicles, etc. Same with fuel. Okay. And that should be relatively straightforward. Now, there is this facility template that they provide on the CMS webpage. You can certainly use it. This is exactly what it looks like, well, without the cute little pictures on it. But this is exactly the layout that you will put in. Nothing very exciting. You can certainly do that and then upload it. The one downside is if there's one error in that tool, what we're told is the whole thing will fault and you won't know why. So we're hopeful again that we'll be able to have a CSV file upload from them to us, from us to them. Sorry. So your governmental ground ambulance services, right, has 4 vehicles. You own 3 and rent 1. This is how you would report that. Okay, under owned. Pretty straightforward. Again, same with, and I'm going to blast by these examples because of the timing. Consumable, so equipment, there's medical, durable, in other words, capital equipment, and medical disposable. And then there's non-medical, durable, or capital equipment and disposable. All right, so recognize, please, or understand that your medical equipment is the stuff that you capitalize, that you reuse multiple. You're going to list that. You're going to be listing that. We've got to put all that information together, as well as your consumables and your medications. All right, because again, medications separate, because we know that something funky can happen with medications and that can majorly drive up costs. Your consumables are all of your disposable medical equipment, your capital equipment, your stretchers, your monitors, your vents, your backboards, or any of that stuff that you have that you will use multiple times. Your non-medical equipment, right, both capital, so your desks, your dispatch monitors, your computers, your, any of the equipment that you would read, your furniture, etc. All right, can I clarify if you should use the templates or not? It's totally up to you if you use the templates. They do list them. Some people find it easier to work in the spreadsheet and then upload the spreadsheet into their tool. That's totally up to you. You can also key this information directly into the tool itself, although we haven't seen the final version. It's really, I'm sorry, I can't provide more information because I've never seen their final tool. In speaking with the faculty members who got a chance, because I'm not an ambulance, I don't work for an ambulance service anymore, and I wasn't selected by CMS. What we were told is that the tool works great. You can plug the information in, or if you want to use the CSV file upload Excel spreadsheet. Some people like working in Excel, or they already have all their information in Excel. That's fine. You just need to make sure that the template, your Excel file, matches the template layout. Otherwise, it will break on the way up. So it's really up to you. Okay, and I don't mean to, I don't have anything in between here and our next session, just until 1 o'clock. So I'll keep going, but I don't want to kill your lunchtime.
I have one other question above Arlen's.
Oh, I didn't see the one above Arlen. Yes. Oh, yeah. Remember, the tool that I'm referring to is CMS's tool. Amber, right? This is why I suggest you work in Amber. You will have had a lot of time and interaction with an online-based cost collection tool that was designed loosely after the CMS tool. By the time that it comes time to report your information, and with any luck, you'll be able to pull a file down out of Amber and just upload it directly to the CMS tool. So what I mean by the tool, when I say the tool, I'll refer to Amber, I'll call it Amber. When I'm talking about the tool, I'm talking about CMS's cost collection tool, which is yet to be finalized. So recognize that we've made multiple recommendations back to them. Thankfully, listened for some, not for others. The question above, we have donated fuel from the city. Should we enter the amount of fuel donated from the city? Let me ask, when you say donated, are you a city or a municipal-based service? If the answer to that is yes, well, then it's not donated. It's not being attributed to your budget.
They are not part of the city. This is a health service district that the city donates the fuel.
When it's a health service district, is it like a political subdivision or an ambulance district like they have in Missouri, where each community pays into that ambulance district to fund
Political
it?
subdivision,
Political subdivision?
yes.
Okay, so in that instance, though, it sounds to me, while it is a legal, I would get the cost of that fuel, and I would report the cost of that fuel, because let me get back to you. My position on that is if it's a political subdivision of that underlying community, that health district is part of it is a pseudo governmental agency. And so in my opinion, if those are being, the only reason that city or that that municipal is donating that fuel is because, again, it's that ambulance district is part of it's part of their EMS response. So I think I will get that answer by the time we come back up at 4:15. But my gut is I'd get the
I
answer.
need a little more clarification on this one. The ambulance service housed their vehicles in the city's fire department building, and the city donated their fuel. However, the ambulance service is not part of the city. They are part of a separate health service district.
Health service district that's not funded by those cities.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, interestingly, we were on the faculty call right before this, and the UP in Michigan, they have a bunch of Indian reservation funded by almost all exclusively federal donated dollars. And so we were working through some of the unusual challenges or unusual funding mechanisms that they have. This sounds like one of those. I want to run that by, not only by the tool, and I'm going to tell you right now, I've read every flipping CMS document there is on this. There's this specific thing is not touched. Let me talk with the group, and I should be able to have that answer by the time we come back up in the afternoon. Hospital district, yeah. And I'm sorry, guys. Remember, this has never been done before, so some of these answers they don't know because they don't even realize this is happening, right? CMS doesn't necessarily know that somebody's donating the fuel or this or that. My thing is, to me, if it's not a direct cost to the agency, generally I'd say if it's not a direct cost to you, then you don't pay it. But in this instance, I don't know that there's part of me that suggests, right, I don't know. I want to look at that. The rules definitely don't touch that specific dynamic. This comes back to that. Remember, hey, if you've seen one ambulance service, you've seen one ambulance service. Guess what? I've never before have I realized, like when we were talking around the country 4 years ago about this, there were people who were selling their old ambulance, turning their old ambulances into traveling barbecue vehicles, and they were making revenue off of that. I would have never guessed that. I mean, pretty cool, but again, if you've seen one, you've seen one. Your non-medical supplies are those desks, furniture, everything else that's not a facility, not a vehicle, and that's not medical equipment. You're going to report all of that, both capital and disposable, paper clips, staples, whatever. Uniforms are separate. I think that's because when you look at fire-based uniform, I know my turnout gear was super pricey compared to my old polyester French blue pants and shirt. So other costs, you're going to check off whether you have any of these costs: billing service, accounting service, vehicle maintenance. So that's not, if you do in-house maintenance, you're reporting those costs in with your vehicle cost and with your labor costs. If you send your stuff out to get fixed and they send you back an itemized bill that says, $100 on labor, $25 on part, you're not reporting that in labor because that's not your labor. You're going to report that in the other cost section. So dispatch call center costs, facility maintenance service costs, if you call a plumber and they come in, IT support, if you contract out labor, which is more and more common these days, and or other costs. So any other costs that didn't fit somewhere else, you're going to plug in here, and you should list and specify what that is, what the amount is, and then what percentage of that cost is attributable to ground ambulance. As we move forward, you're going to go in again. Do you have biohazardous medical removal fees, fees to physicians to oversee paramedics? All right. So let's say you pay that affiliate medical hospital for, paramedical or EMT oversight, laundry, travel, organizational dues, subsidies that you had to pay to a fire department for response fees or stuff like that, funds to non-transporting organizations, overhead allocation for parent companies. So if you are a subsidiary and you have to pay some money up to the parent company, any board of directors, trustees expenses, advertising, events, etc. All right, all of those are listed here. You're going to say yes or no, and that's going to ask you how much it is. 911 service fees, fines, taxes, licenses, liability, malpractice, comp, etc. Right? So physicals, recruiting. Go ahead. Oh, sorry, I thought I heard something. All right, and then total costs. If it wasn't, all right, so first, other costs, if it wasn't reported somewhere else, this is where you're gonna list it, this is where you're gonna put the amount, and this is where you're gonna put percentage of that is attributable to ground ambulance. When you get to section 12, everything else you listed before in costs, section 12, those two should equal. Now, what's interesting is in the tool by CMS, there is not yet something that says, something doesn't work for us. Amber, there is, but we're hopeful that CMS will give us something doesn't work for us. Your numbers don't jive. This is the advantage again to using something like an Amber, where you can go in and it will tell you, hey, you've made an error here somewhere. You need to go back because you have costs that don't jive. Revenues, and this is the last section. So I'm really sorry, Kim is not going to invite me back next year because I'm late. But revenue section, the good news is we've had a lot of great questions, and those questions have resulted hopefully in better understanding. For a county ran EMS service, how do you itemize accounting? Go ahead.
Before you get to revenue, there's one more expense question in the chat.
Yep, that one from Josh.
Yes.
Okay. For a county ran ambulance EMS service, how do you itemize accounting services, IT services, etc.? These are separate departments within the county. Excellent point. You're going to need to go to if you're a county ran ambulance service and your county, like you wouldn't have your own HR person, you're going to need to go to your county and say, hey, I am doing this cost collection piece and I have to report what our costs are for IT, what our costs are for accounting, what our costs are for HR. Can you please provide me with those costs, right? And those costs now, if you should technically be reporting the hours and the wages, because you are one entity, but alternatively, you could report it in the IT section or in the accounting section. The most right way to do it, and CMS has said this, they've addressed this one directly. The rightest way to do it is if in fact you can account the hours and the wages, then you should do so in the appropriate categories, admin, facilities. If you cannot, right, or if you do not, report it in the other section where it said IT, and I can flip back here quickly. IT, support services, other facilities maintenance, whatever. You can report it in there. What they've said is, whatever you choose to do, just do it in one, not in both. Okay. So hopefully, Josh, that answers the question. And by the way, they're going to go, well, how the heck do we do that? We'll go, okay, well, listen, what percentage of your time is spent out of all the departments here in the organization? What percentage of your time is spent on our EMS agency, right? And if it turns, they're going to have to come up with some allocation method. And, then you could say, okay, well, if that IT person's total salary is $50,000 a year and 20% of that is attributable to us, then 10,000 goes to you. That's your cost. All right. Revenue sections, we're only looking for revenue by that NPI, that one organization. We're not looking for air revenue. We're not looking for other revenue, fire burn permits. I don't want that revenue. All right. We only want the revenue associated or affiliated with your ground ambulance service. All right. So you're going to report those based upon the specific payer, at least as it relates to ground ambulance transport revenue. So you're going to need to do them in these categories. If your system's not designed yet to break these out, you need to make sure that they can do that. Traditional Medicare fee for service, Medicare Advantage. So those managed Medicare Advantage plans, you were going to need to break that out from traditional Medicare fee for service, traditional Medicaid fee for service, and then those Medicaid managed plans. You're going to need to break those out. TRICARE, VA, commercial insurance, workers' comp. I know that's challenged, like Travelers does auto and comp. You're going to need to break out your comp from your commercial insurance. And then self-pay. Here's what I'll tell you. If you can't break the comp out, the reason comp is broken out is because often comp is at negotiated rates, much in the way that Medicaid is. What I'd say is, to the extent that you can create these payer categories in your system, do so, and then break them out that way. Whatever you do, if you can't break comp out from commercial, it just is what it is. It will average out your overall revenue for those services will be reduced if in fact your comp is a reduced negotiated rate. But you're going to say, did I receive compensation from these sources? If so, what was that total dollar or revenue amount? And then if there's any, did it include any cost sharing amount? So if in your system you had a copay that you included in your commercial insurance number, they just want to know that. Most people don't. Any copays or deductibles paid by patients, they report as self-pay, but they just want to know if in fact your traditional Medicare fee for service included the amount that you collected from the patient. They want to know that. All right. So make sure that I don't know why they asked this question. How did you know, how often did your organization bill? Was it never, sometimes, usually, always, or I didn't have any patient transports in that category? The problem I have with this question is, you know how many times my kid goes, you always ask me to do this. I'm like, well, I've asked you twice. Always. I'm like, twice. That's not always. No one defines what sometimes, usually, and always is. This is the dumbest question that they could have asked on this entire thing. I have absolutely no idea why they've listed this, but they've got to imagine they've never told us. But do the best you can with this question. It is in there. Whether you sometimes, never, or usually bill. Usually, I don't even know what that means. Hey, you know, are you going to show up to work? Usually I do. Well, I don't know what that means. It's kind of nonsense, but that's where it's at. So then they are going to ask you to go through and indicate whether you received from any revenue from any others, from contracts with hospitals, revenues from subcontracted ambulance providers, membership fees. Like there are a lot of membership fee organizations that have membership programs, charitable donations, executive loan. That's not supposed to say load. It's supposed to say executive loan programs. Some people, their CEOs are so awesome that they lend them out to other people to fix or to manage their program-related investments. So if you had revenue because you guys have a bunch of CDs that turned around and generated some revenue, you're going to report that. Local taxes earmarked for EMS, contracted revenue from local governments in return for services, enterprise or utility rates, or sale of assets. So right, you're selling that ambulance that you turned into a barbecue truck. Debt or bond financing, so you can see these matching grants, etc. All right, you're going to list whether you had any, and then you're going to put what that amount was, and then what percentage of that revenue was attributable to ground ambulance. We are on the second to last slide, folks. You are close to lunch. My stomach's growling too. Actually, you're in the morning, right? It's only 10:20 where you are, so sorry. Immediate actions. If you're not sure if you're selected, call me, email me, text me, whatever. I'll find out. Sean, I got your back. Assemble your data team and contractor vendors, right? You should have a team at your organization. By the way, if there's only like 20 of you, the team's going to maybe be all of you. But what I'll say is, don't be afraid to include outside people, folks like me. I'm more than happy to help you out as part of your membership. And as I said, if you have to listen to me drone on, then, and especially if I drag you past your break, then you should. And then put together that team, because without a team, it's not going to happen. Contact your MAC. In your case, it's Novitas, I believe Amy told me. Subscribe to Amber. Again, we're not looking at your individual data. We just want to be able to prepare a defense in the event that, let's say that this data comes back and they go, hell no, we've been paying you way more than we were supposed to. I am very concerned about that. Even though I don't think it will happen, I've just seen other stuff that has happened that I didn't think would ever happen. Snapshot of your personnel at the beginning of the year. Track your volunteer time, your time/hours. Modify your dispatch systems to capture that total time on task. That is an absolute must, because that goes to goes to total time and cost. Snapshot your vehicle mileage. Most people track vehicle mileage, but one way to do it is beginning of the year, snapshot the mileage, end of the year, snapshot the mileage, everything in between is your mileage. And then check your payer categories to make sure you have them right. Here are those resources. You can click on, these are hyperlinks, right? Anything that's underlined is a hyperlink. And so you can get to those resources. These are the ones from us at the AAA. And I say us, I'm a contractor to the AAA. I don't actually work for them. I'm their consultant. But what I will say is all this information is available to you if through the grant from the Stavic Foundation and the AAA. These are all the CMS resource page. This is, again, a clickable link plus a link to the downloads. You can download the report. You can download the list. You can download the FAQs, any quick reference guide. Everything is there. And then last but not least, and way over my time, I think I'm going to have to start paying a penalty to Tim and Kim. Well, actually, probably should be to all of you. If I were there, I'd owe you all a drink. So next year, if we're all together, I commit to buying everybody a drink. There'll be bartender, round of drinks. So you can just send an email to hello@ambulance.org. And that will go into the ticketing system that we have called Happy Fox that then goes to all of us, and then we answer it and we make sure we get back to you. Or you can just email me. I'm smore@moreemsconsulting.com. I already plugged my phone number in there. But certainly don't wing it. By the way, if you walked into surgery and your doctor's like, you ever done this before? Like, just gonna wing it, right? Nothing good comes out of that. What I'd say is don't wing it. There are people to help. I know Amy and I have talked a lot about, about being able to assist agencies with that stuff. So don't wing it, right? Getting this right is going to be critically important. So I'm going to send these slides over to, I'm just enlarging so I can see the room. I'm going to send these slides over to Kim in a minute. I am in the meantime going to answer those questions. And then, or I'm going to try and get the answers to those questions by the time we come back this afternoon. So any other final questions before I close my mouth for a little while? Wait a minute. Please send the recorded sessions to T. Freeman. All right, well, that's for you, Kim. And all right, any other questions? Kim, what's the penalty for being late?
No penalty.
No penalties that I know of yet. That's all you have to say. He's all I commit to. All right, guys, I'm so sorry for holding you over. I know this is super exciting stuff. And I'll look forward to chatting with you this afternoon about recruitment and retention costs.
Speak to you offline about your penalty.
All right, thanks, guys. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.